Forgotten Voices of the Great War, 1916, from the Toll House in Lancaster. Introduction. Then the British Army went over the top. Our machine gunners crawled out of their bunkers, red-eyed and dirty, covered in the blood of their fallen comrades, and opened up a terrific fire. In February 1916, the Germans launched a major offensive. General Falkenhayn's strategy was to deliver the heaviest blow he could against France, perhaps calculating that after the hideous losses of 1914 and 15, the French might conceivably crack. His objective was Verdun, which lay close to Metz, which had been occupied by Germany since 1871 and had served as a major depot for their armies since then. For an attack in this sector, the German railway network could ferry hundreds of heavy guns right up to the front line, together with vast quantities of ammunition. More than 1,000 guns and mortars fired 2 million rounds at the French front line to open the battle. But despite this, the first infantry attacks that went in the last light on February 21st, 1916, met heroic resistance from scattered groups of survivors. Additional bombardments were called for, and the Germans slowly ground their way forward. However, their rate of advance was little more than a kilometre a day during the first week and came to a virtual halt in March. As the Battle of Verdun proceeded, the French urged the British to advance the date of the Allied offensive to relieve the pressure on their forces. The Somme offensive, which became a predominantly British battle. The Germans had fortified their positions on the Somme with professional thoroughness. 3 successive lines of defences followed the high ground across gently undulating farmland. Thickets of barbed wire presented an attacker with the most fearsome obstacles. Machine guns in concrete strong points were deployed with interlocking zones of fire, most sighted to fire into the flank of attacking infantry. The chalky soil was excellent for tunnelling, and German engineers buried deep to create almost indestructible shelters for the soldiers manning the front line. German artillery positions lay well back, camouflaged from the air, but ready to deluge no man's land with higher explosives. Their fire directed from the front by observation positions with telephone lines buried far beneath the shell-torn ground. The British plan was not unlike General Falkenhayn's at Verdun, to pulverise the enemy trenches with such weight of fire that the trenches would collapse, the barbed wire would be cut, and resistance, at least in the immediate front line, brushed aside. Again, like the Germans at Verdun, they anticipated that the greatest danger would be from enemy counterattacks, catching the assault troops disorganised after their initial success. Consequently, the leading waves carried picks, shovels and sandbags with which to fortify their positions once they had captured them. No British artilleryman had ever had so much firepower at his disposal. The bombardment lasted a week, beginning on June 24th. 5 days intensive shelling was planned, with pauses to trick the Germans into manning their frontline trenches and unmasking their hidden batteries. It was extended by 2 days, as the attack, planned for June 29th, was delayed until July 1st because of bad weather. 0 hour was fixed after first light at the request of the French, who wanted good observation for their military. Many British officers had wanted to go over the top while it was still dark. The whistles blew at 7:30 a.m. and tens of thousands of men clambered up the assault ladders and into no man's land. They advanced at a steady pace so as not to become disorganised. The bombardment had failed to crush the enemy defences. In many areas, the barbed wire was uncut. Field guns firing shrapnel formed a high proportion of the artillery on the Somme, and their ammunition was not effective enough in this war, nor were the German machine guns destroyed, or even suppressed. The machine gunners occupied their strong points, and across the 20-mile front, British hopes were dashed to the steady stutter of the Maxim guns. The German artillery counter-barrage opened with murderous effect, deluging no man's land with high explosive, and in some sectors wrecking the British front-line trenches. On July 1st, 1916, the British Army sustained over 57,000 casualties, of which 19,250 were killed or died of wounds, 1/3 of the total force. The Battle of the Somme continued until November 19th. Small-scale attacks by the British took place every week, but there were several concerted efforts across the front. The first and most successful took place on July 14th, when General Rawlinson was granted his wish to make a night attack. This took most of its objectives and even led to a brief cavalry attack on the late afternoon of the following day. However, another major push on July 23rd failed with heavy losses. The casualty lists published in Britain staggered the nation, especially as the territorial gains were so negligible. Yet the battle was an equally grim experience for the Germans. The unbending Prussian tradition of halten, was zu halten ist, hold on to whatever can be held, was applied with no regard for the lives of the soldiers. On almost any given day of the Somme battle, the Germans launched some sort of counterattack. In the teeth of massive British fire superiority, if the British gunners failed to wipe out the German infantry in the pre-battle bombardment, they made up for it with deadly accurate fire that smashed many a German counterblow, even as it assembled on its start line. The Royal Artillery fired 7 million rounds on the Somme between July 2nd and September 15th, roughly 10 weeks, and by the end of the battle, 138 German divisions had been rotated in and out of the front line, compared with 75 at Verdun. On September 15th, the British attacked on a 10-mile front between Combles and the Anker Valley, between Thiepval. 12 divisions took part, their attacks supported by 36 armoured fighting vehicles, cover name tanks. Dangerous work. Mabel Lethbridge, munitions worker. I was put into a shell filling shed where I was taught to fill 18-pounder shells. We girls never went into a shed unless there were some of the older workers there to help us. But the older workers were always moaning. They were upset and miserable because there had been so many explosions, and I think they were justified, as we heard that machines we were going to be asked to work on had been condemned. We were continually searched for cigarettes, matches, and anything you might have made of metal. This went on hour after hour. You were continually pulled out and searched. There was a great feeling of tension all the time, although it was not exactly fear, because we were very merry and always singing, very happy. The only difficulty I found was when I was put onto one of those condemned machines, was that it was a very tiring work. The shells were very heavy and we had to kneel down in front of the machine. When you stood up, you just felt you hadn't got any knees and you hadn't got any back except one aching mass. That was from all the carrying, the long hours and the weight. Corporal Charles Quinnell, 9th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers. My hometown of Woolwich was a very busy place with all the munition workers. The place just hummed with activity, plenty of money about. All my friends had joined up. I was lonely. One thing I noticed was that after being with the boys in the army, we were a race apart from civilians. They hadn't the slightest conception of what conditions were like. So after a time, you didn't talk about it. Long forgotten rule of law. Lieutenant Montague Cleave, Royal Garrison Artillery, is pictured right. I was asked to dinner at the brigade headquarters of the Infantry Brigadier. There was a terrible din from the machine guns and shells bursting all around us, but he insisted on having an old-fashioned mess dinner at 7 o'clock promptly. We sat at a large table in this dugout and the wine was brought round in decanters. This was a bit of a contrast to trench life, where we often had to cook our own meals. I used a little bivvy tin that I had. It was a tiny saucepan with a lid. Inside the saucepan was a methylated spirits lamp. What I found to be marvellous at an observation post was a tin of bully beef. I'd fry it on this little stove. It was delicious. During World War I, there was a rule in the British Army that soldiers had to be at least 19 years old to serve overseas, including France. This regulation was put in place to ensure younger soldiers were not exposed to the harsh conditions and dangers of the front lines. However, there were many instances where younger soldiers blatantly lied about their age to enlist and were sent to the front before they were legally allowed. Dentists for the first time. Reverend John Duffield, chaplain, Lancashire Battalion, Bantam Brigade. One night I was in the line. I was helping the medical officer in his job and doing my own at the same time, when two men came in. The first was one of our men and the other was a German, and they were both wounded. Our man said to the doctor, "Here's a job I made for you, doctor, and he made this one for me. What could you do with men like that?" They were grand. Lieutenant Godfrey Buxton, 6th Battalion, Duke of Wellington's Regiment. We didn't have dentists in any great number until 1916. Then when the dentist came over and the men got their teeth put right, removing the bad ones, it certainly got them into another era of health, because their food could be properly digested. It seems a small thing, but it was of tremendous value when these dentists came and improved teeth. Until then, I don't think the public were as conscious of the value of teeth, and I believe it began a tremendous change in the attitude of the working classes after the war. Quite a change to what had happened before it. Lieutenant Montague Cleave, Royal Garrison Artillery. Before the wireless was invented, we had to do the whole thing by telephone lines. We put them in the trenches for protection. Up to 20 lines all mixed up. Whenever a shell burst in a trench, as thousands did, they bust all the lines. Confusion, with mud, lines and debris everywhere. The telephone system was a complete failure. Jock McDavid, 6th Battalion, Royal Scots Fusiliers. Out of the first car came this well-known figure dressed in a long, fine textured waterproof. He was wearing a polyhole, a hairy one, helmet, and a Sam Brown belt holster with a revolver in it. He was followed by his staff. I could hardly believe my eyes when I saw the second car, which was piled high with luggage of every description. To my horrified amazement, on the very top was a full-length tin bath. This very well-known figure came forward, gave a warm handshake, and introduced himself as Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill. After his arrival, all sorts of military and civilian VIPs came to visit. The military types to see if they could criticise his duties as a battalion commander, but they didn't find much. The brigadier came up late one afternoon and spotted a gap in the parapet that had been made that day. It had only been repaired the night before. The little brigadier turned to the commanding officer and said, "Look here, Colonel Churchill, this is a very dangerous thing, to leave this gap unprotected." And the colonel, turning and fixing him with his piercing eyes, said, "But you know, sir, this is a very dangerous war." HRH Edward, Prince of Wales. Lieutenant Graham Greenwell, 4th Battalion, Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. An older officer in my regiment, Alan Gibson, said, "Let's go over and have a drink with the 2nd Coldstream." So off we went, and they were playing cricket behind the lines. While we were there watching the cricket, chatting and having a drink, up came a young chap on a bicycle who looked about 14. This was the Prince of Wales, born 1894, pictured in Bethune in 1914. The poor chap was always trying to sneak up to the front line. He had been taken onto the staff at General Headquarters, where he made great friends with the pilots, particularly a chap called Barker, who got a VC later. He got into terrible trouble for taking the Prince up on several occasions over enemy lines, and was nearly court-martialed for that. The Prince, to do him justice, wanted to get in on the act and serve as a regimental officer in the Grenadiers. He went to Kitchener, who everyone was terrified of at the beginning of the war, and said, "What does it matter if I do get killed? I've got 4 brothers." And Kitchener said, "I'm not in the slightest worried about you being killed, sir. What we cannot afford is to have you taken prisoner." All that was part of the thing that irked the Prince of Wales. Horrific accident. Lieutenant Stephen Westman, German medical officer. At the Battle for Verdun, I was a medical officer with an artillery formation. We had taken Fort Douaumont and had observation posts set up looking far into the enemy countryside. There were 2 communication trenches, and the French artillery knew exactly where they were and fired on them without pause. Before I went, somebody told me to take a gas mask with me. I'd never seen a gas mask before, but we knew the French artillery now fired gas shells onto German positions. My gas mask consisted of a piece of surgical gauze with a bit of cotton wool soaked in a certain fluid. We had a man with acute appendicitis and carried him down to an underground area, protected by reinforced concrete, where there was a little operating theatre. There were 2 German surgeons constantly on duty, and by chance, one of them was from Berlin, my native town. We operated on this man, but then the tricky question arose as to how to bring this man back into the German line, together with other casualties. It was decided to do it at night. One day I wandered through the casements and found one that had been bricked up. Somebody had written on it, "Here lie 1,052 German soldiers." I asked what that meant, and they told me a whole battalion was in that casement. It had been used to store barrels of fuel for the flamethrowers, and somebody must have been very careless as the whole thing blew up. Nobody was left. They all perished in an instant. They couldn't even get at them, so they just bricked it up. Two boys, Corporal William Skip. We had a sniper's post, which was just a sheet of metal, 2 inches high and 12 inches wide, just a hole big enough to put the end of a rifle through. Well, we had two boys who were orphans. They'd been brought up together, joined up together, and been all the way through together. They were standing in the trenches, and one said, "What's this, George? Have a look through here." And he had no sooner approached it than down he went with a bullet through his forehead. Now his friend was so flabbergasted, he too had a look, and less than a minute later he was down the trench with his friend, with a bullet through his forehead. Sergeant Ernest Bryan, 17th Battalion, King's Liverpool Regiment. I asked the Brigadier if it was possible for his brigade major to put our equipment on, and he said, "Certainly." So I got two privates, Lewis gunners, to put everything on him. Bombs in his pockets, sandbags, spade, kit, rations, extra ammunition around his neck. Then I said, "How do you feel, sir?" He said, "It's a hell of a way." So I said, "You forgot the rifle. You can't sling it over your shoulder. You have to carry it in your hand, ready. In your left hand, you've got a pannier, which weighs 46 pounds. Try walking 100 yards in the farm field behind us that has just been ploughed, and that's a playground to what we'll have to go over on the Somme." He said, "You feel very strongly about this, don't you?" I replied, "Wouldn't you, sir? Wouldn't anybody." Captured German gas mask. Lieutenant Tom Adlam, 7th Battalion, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment. At times, life on the Western Front was bloody awful. When we were training behind the lines, we'd march with ground sheets round us to keep out the rain. We'd dry out at night, strip down to our pants, hang them round the fire on sticks. At least we had inside billets, and we had our baggage, so we could get changed. But the men were remarkably cheerful. In fact, the wetter it was, the more cheerful they seemed to get. I had great admiration for the British soldier in those days. All the soldiers in France took the rough with the smooth remarkably well. The photograph shows the Northumberland Fusiliers in jubilant mood after capturing German gas masks and helmets at St. Eloi. The decision of the court-martial. Lance Sergeant Charles Quinnell, 9th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers. 60 men and 2 NCOs out of each battalion had to be labourers for the Royal Engineers mining parties. We were billeted in French barracks at Bethune, and the idea was that 3 parties of 30 men would attend each mine. 3 mines at Givenchy, known as Duxville 1, Duxville 2 and Duxville 3. Now these lads were miners. They were sent from mining districts such as Staffordshire, Leicester, Yorkshire and Northumberland, and they were really masters with their tools. They were a rough lot, but were brave men. They had a rifle, but didn't know how to use it. Every now and then, we'd have to stop work We'd leave one man at the face who'd sit on a sandbag with the stethoscope pressing against the wall so he could hear the Germans working and talking. We had a sergeant who came to us when the Dardanelles were evacuated, a very regimental type of man. His first day in the trenches, two of the miners slummocked along into the front line. They used to walk with their heads down and took no notice of us, and we took no notice of them. Anyway, this sergeant didn't know who they were and yelled, "Halt!" Then when they didn't attempt to halt, he gave the order again. But when they didn't obey, he brought up his rifle and bang, he shot the first man through the head. Then he did exactly the same with the other man. So a bullet went through both of their heads. He killed them stone dead. He was later court-martialed and reduced to corporal. 7 days without food and drink. Lieutenant W.E. Walter Simmons, Royal Garrison Artillery. The initial softening bombardment for the Battle of July 1st, extending over a period of 7 days. The enemy trench system was in the form of a very strong front line and support line anything between 200 and 400 yards in the rear. The two were connected by communication trenches. There was a reserve line between 300 and 500 yards away. All this had to be dealt with, trench junctions demolished, and a general annihilation of the area in which the enemy was living. The task was carried out each day, and meanwhile, while the heavier guns were annihilating earthworks, the field artillery were busy cutting the dense wire, protecting the German front line, endeavouring to cut paths for our assaulting infantry at 0 hour. We fired about 800 to 1,000 rounds a day, the equivalent of many tons. It took 12 men to man an 8-inch howitzer, the shell of which weighed 200 pounds, and the preservation of manpower necessitated careful reliefs, which took place every 4 hours. At 5:30 the barrage came down. It consisted of light artillery on the front line coupled with light howitzers. 300 yards beyond that came down the heavier natures, the 6-inch, the 60-pounder, the 8-inch, the 12-inch and the 15-inch howitzers were allocated special targets and strong points such as 45 villages. Within a few moments the air vibrated with the concussion. Lieutenant Stephen Westman, German medical officer. For a full week we were under incessant bombardment, day and night. The shells dropped on us, our dugouts crumbled. Even the rats became hysterical, seeking refuge in our flimsy shelters. For 7 days and 7 nights we had nothing to eat and nothing to drink, while shell after shell burst upon us. A trench. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Irwin, 8th East Surrey Regiment. We had a lot of warning that the Battle of the Somme was coming. It was such a big show and the first of its kind. I'm quite sure the Boche knew as much about it as we did. The Boche knew we were coming, and if he hadn't, the barrage would have told him. As for the 2 or 3 days before the Somme, it was intensive. In order to break up the wire in front of the front line, we were all young and optimistic. I took it for granted that the wire would be cut. We'd massacre the Boche in their front line, get our objective, then go on to the next mission. Photograph shows the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers fixed bayonets before the attack on Beaumont Hamel in July. Football plays a part. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Irwin, 8th East Surrey Regiment. I was battalion commander on the first day, and it was difficult to know exactly what to do. One's instinct was to get on with the chaps and see what was going on. On the other hand, we'd been warned over and over again that officers' lives must not be thrown away in doing something they shouldn't. In fact, commanding officers should lead from behind and only go forward when the attack had lost its impetus. And that's what I tried to do. Captain Neville was commanding B Company, and a few days before the battle, he came to me with a suggestion. He said that as he and his men were all equally ignorant of what their conduct would be when they got into action, he thought it might be helpful, as he had 400 yards to go, and he knew it would be covered by machine gun fire, if he could furnish each platoon with a football and allow them to kick it forward and follow it. I sanctioned the idea on condition that he and his officers really kept command of their units and didn't allow it to develop into a rush after the ball. If a man came across the football, he could kick it forward, but he must not chase after it. I think myself, it did help them enormously. It took their minds off it. Gunner Leonard Arnsworth, 124th Heavy Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery. I remember a most unusual thing when we were out in the open before the Somme battle. In the evening, there was a swarm of huge beetles, each an inch long, coming from the Boche lines. They marched along for half an hour or more. Where they had come from or where they were going, I don't know, but they were never deviating. In the end, we moved a few yards either side of this stream of huge beetles. Photos were needed. Lieutenant Cecil Lewis, Royal Flying Corps. During the build-up, we were taking photographs of the lines to see what new digging had been done, what the effect of the bombardment was, and so on. One had a tremendous feeling of war, but what it meant when everything was in position. I did many evening patrols when the whole of the ground beneath the darkening evening was just like a veil of flashing sequins. Each one was a gun. 2 days before the attack opened, we had to get some photos that were badly needed. We were down to about 1,000 feet in murky weather, with a cloud bank overhead and this grey swathe on one side. And when one saw these continuous flashes, one had the feeling they were firing at us. This was ridiculous, of course, but quite terrifying at the time. Then, having finished the photos and got out of the buffeting, one thought, well, heavens alive, I've come through, because many of my friends were hit by these barrages. You know, destroyed by a direct hit from a passing shell. It was a fantastic sight when the hurricane bombardment started, because every gun we had, and there were thousands of them, had all been let loose at once. You could hear the guns above the roar of the aircraft, like rain on a window pane. And then at 8 o'clock there was a blast on the Basel salient, and suddenly the whole earth heaved up. From the ground came what looked like 2 enormous cypress trees, great dark cone-shaped silhouettes, which lifted the earth 3, 4, 5,000 feet up. We watched this happening, and a moment later, of course, we struck the repercussion wave of the blast. It flung us backwards. A bad day. Captain Alfred Irving, the 8th East Surrey Regiment. They went forward shouting with such energy, kicking the football ahead of them. But so quickly, Neville and his second in command were both killed, plus his company sergeant major. I picked up all the chaps I could, went over the parapet myself. I stood well out in the open and said, come on, come on. They all came quite smoothly. Captain Alan Hanbury Sparrow, Royal Berkshire Regiment. I thought I saw that our front line had got into the German trenches and reported as such to the division. I said, I can't really see what's happening. I'm going forward, but I got the message to stay where I was. And presently, as the barrage went forward, the air cleared and I could see. In the distance, I saw heaps of dead in no man's land, and the barrage bounding on towards Pozieres, third German line. I saw Germans almost standing up in their trenches, firing and sniping at those who had taken refuge in the shell holes. I waited further, then I saw another brigade that was ordered to resume the battle. Providentially, for that brigade, the order was soon cancelled, and the realisation came that what had really happened was one of the most enormous disasters to have befallen the 8th Division. Captain Philip Neame, the 15th Field Company Royal Engineers. At Goncourt, I was with 56th London Division. We attacked successfully and captured the German trenches. The division on our left was mown down by machine gun fire. The division on our right was stopped by artillery barrages. The result was that we got in, but were then isolated all day. We had captured our objectives, but then had to withdraw at night. So many dead. Captain Alfred Irving, the 8th East Surrey Regiment. Eventually, we reached the German 3rd Reserve Line. We were so lamentably few that there was very little we could do that night. So I posted the men as well as I could. And while we were heavily shelled, we weren't attacked. The next day we were relieved. We'd come down from 800 men to something under 200 in that attack. And it seemed to me a dreadful waste of life. All my best chaps had gone. We buried 8 young officers in one grave before we left. It was a terrible massacre. I think the attack should have been called off until the wire had been cut. I think they ought to have known what the condition of the wire was through their intelligence officers before we ever got them to July the 1st. Lieutenant Montague Cleave, Royal Garrison Artillery. One thing I shall never forget was my first experience of dead bodies. On the first day at Albert, the weather was very hot. I was sent up to an observation post. I went with a marvellous officer who was later killed, a splendid young subaltern called Priddy. We could not walk along the trenches without treading on dead bodies, German and British. The stench and the flies were appalling. That was one of my miserable memories of the Somme. It was pathetic, really. Eventually one just got over it, thought nothing of it. We couldn't help it. We were alive, and that's what mattered. And being alive, we jolly well had to get on with it. Aberystwyth Purcell Crater. Corporal Reginald Leonard Hayne, the 1st Battalion, the Honourable Artillery Corps. I saw the effect of the mines. I saw the crater at Aberystwyth, see the photograph with 3 soldiers in it. It really petrified me, the size of it. I mean, it was as big as a cathedral. Private Charles Taylor, the 13th Battalion, Yorks and Lancs. I started crawling towards our lines. I'd never seen so many dead men clumped together. I thought to myself, all the world's dead. We're all dead. Everybody's dead. Everywhere I pass, to my left and right, were dead men laying on the ground. Sheffield hospitals.
Shall we stop there? Group place, I think. It's in
Sheffield Hospitals. Marjorie Llewellyn, schoolgirl in Sheffield. Very soon we began to get the wounded arriving in the city from the Somme battle. The Teachers' Training College was turned into the 3rd Northern General Hospital and staffed by consultants from the other Sheffield hospitals. There were soldiers in some of the other general hospitals, of course, but there were far too many of them coming in to be taken by those alone. As you can imagine, when the men got to the stage of being able to walk around a little bit in their hospital blue, they were made much of and didn't lack for invitations out for tea. We were very, very proud of our boys. The photograph is of the men of the Royal Fusiliers enjoying a rest after the battle on La Basselle, July 7th, 1916. Conscientious objectors. Howard Martin, conscientious objector. The ranks of the No Conscription Fellowship were made up of men from every conceivable walk of life. You had all sorts of religious groups, from the Salvation Army to Seventh-day Adventists, Church of England and Roman Catholics. Then you had the more politically minded, the Independent Labour Party, and different degrees of socialists. Then a very curious group of what I used to call the artistically minded, artists, musicians, all that. They had a terrific repugnance of war. We were threatened with the death sentence. Finally, we had the Second Court Martial, which took a whole day. Under escort, we were taken out, one by one, to the middle of the square. The officer in charge of proceedings read out the various crimes. Then, the sentence of the court is you to suffer death by being shot. There was a suitable pause. There was another long pause, but subsequently commuted to penal servitude for 10 years. And that was that. It was all very strange. You had a feeling of being outside yourself, as if it wasn't affecting you personally, that you were just looking on at the proceedings. It was very curious. Tanks. Lieutenant Montague Cleve, Royal Garrison Artillery. It was a complete and utter surprise to the Germans that we had ever devised such a thing as a tank. They were so shattered when they first appeared on the Somme that all resistance in the German section collapsed. The photo shows a tank being guided across an old trench. The mistake we made then was not to have prepared for this lack of opposition. We should have had our cavalry all ready to take over from the tanks and wipe them out. We could have turned the German flank in no time, but the success of the tanks took us by surprise, and we were so ill prepared that nobody followed them up. The tanks had a complete walkthrough. By appointment to the Queen. Gunner George Cole, 3rd Northumbrian Brigade, Royal Field Artillery. I can remember going past the church in Albert with the Madonna. There was a legend that on the day this Madonna fell, the war would finish. I was a bit of a comic, so I said, let's knock it down and the war will finish. The photograph shows Captain George Jameson, Royal Field Artillery, who also served with the Northumberland Hussars. Captain George Jameson, Battalion, 1st Northumberland Hussars. I hung my Thresherham Glenny coat up at the door. Later on, the weather switched to freezing. The ground got iron hard, and I didn't see my coat for at least 3 weeks. But when I got back for it, it was so frozen that it broke into pieces. Thresherham Glenny began business in the Strand in 1696, in the reign of William III, and they are by appointment to Her Majesty the Queen, tailors and shirt makers, London. drove the Germans out. Captain Tom Adlam, 7th Battalion, Beds and Hearts Regiment. We'd been in reserve when our battalion was called in to try and straighten out the line. Then just before we went up, my CO was called away, so I was put in charge of the company. I was briefed at headquarters because we'd already tried several times in daylight. I was told that this would be a night attack, so we had to get into the trench at night, then try and bomb our way to these strong points. Luckily, just before the attack, my CO came back, but by then it had taken us so long to get into position, it was almost daylight. The section of trench my platoon faced was only about 100 yards away, so we did get quite a long way before the machine guns started up. We dived into shell holes, and I thought, we've got to get into this trench somehow or other. So I went crawling along from shell hole to shell hole till I came to the officer in charge of the next platoon. I said to him, I'm not more than 50 yards from the trench, so get a bomb in your hand, pull out the pin, hold it tight, stand up, run 2 or 3 yards and throw it. They all got up and ran, and we got into our bit of trench. In it we found bags of German bombs. On them was written 5 seconds. So I experimented with one. It worked perfectly. My sergeant said, bloody good shot, sir. Hit the bugger right in the chest. I think when the Germans found their own bombs coming back at them, it rather put the wind up them. So the men brought armfuls of these bombs along, and I went 1, 2, 3 each time. It was most effective. Then we got close to where the machine gun was. I started throwing as fast as I could. We charged up the trench. We never caught the Germans, but we drove them out. Victoria Cross. Captain Tom Adlam, 7th Battalion, Beds and Hearts Regiment. We went on for some time, holding this position and working our way up the trenches as far as we could. Then my CO came up and said, you're hurt, Tom, let's have a look at it. And he put a field dressing on it. Then said, you go back, you've done enough. So I sat down for a time and the fighting went on. It was a surprise when I got the VC for my actions, because I just did a job out there. It's funny how I heard about it. I'd gone back to Colchester and I'd been in town for an evening out. When I got back to the mess, the orderly room porter said, there's a lot of telegrams for you, sir. There were about a dozen of them, many of them saying the same thing. Congratulations, heartiest congratulations, congratulations from the regiment. So I said, can I get a wire off to my father for me? And I wrote, why congratulations? I know nothing. My father wired back, I heard the papers are asking you for a photograph of you as you have been awarded the Victoria Cross. And that's how I heard. The papers I heard on Saturday, so it could come out in the Monday papers. And on Monday there were photographs of me all over the newspapers. Many brave men died. Sergeant Major Richard Tobin, the Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. Colonel Freyberg said, hello Tobin, how are you? I replied, all right sir. He said, we'll get a VC today. So I replied, you can have mine as well. He got his. Our final objective was the village of Beaucourt. We hadn't enough men to take it, so we dug in and waited for reinforcements. However, there was no counterattack that night. One of our men went out and returned gleeful. He'd seen a German wagon going along bringing rations, so he bayoneted the driver and pinched the mail. In the mailbag was a box of cigars, so Freyberg sent it back to our general. We assembled at 1 o'clock, then waited until 6 o'clock. We stood in dead silence. You couldn't make a noise. Then it was 5 minutes to go. then 0, and all hell let loose. There was our barrage, then the German barrage, and over the top we went. As soon as you go over the top, the fear and terror left us. You don't look, you see. You don't listen, you hear. You are one with your weapon. You see a line of men and a blur of shells. Then came the mist of the November dawn. We saw a gap in the line and closed in. Finally we reached the Germans' front line and saw figures rising from the ground with their hands up. We were soon across the second line and then the third, which was deserted, so we rested there a bit. I discovered my battalion was down to less than 300 from over 1,000, and out of 20 officers there was just one left, a captain. He was a very good chap, but he'd never been in battle before. I was a sergeant major, so I knew what had to be done, that I would tell him and he could do it. If he did, and I felt very lonely. Casualty list. Mary Brough Roberts, munitions worker. Munitions workers were just about the lowest form of life in the eyes of the general public. We were supposed to make a great deal of money, and as other people didn't make so much, they called us all sorts of names. I can't speak of what people earned making shells, but I know the wage for filling them was only 25 shillings a week for a girl. In fact, you had to pay for all your meals. You didn't get any free. But when they finally went on strike, the money was raised to by 5 and 6 a week, and they introduced a bonus system. The most depressing thing about the war was the casualty list. Every time you opened a paper, it seemed to be nothing but casualty lists. And you always found people on them that you knew. And everybody wore black, and that was depressing as well. Black, black everywhere. Boys who came home didn't try and depress you. They tried to be as cheerful as they could. But they came home dirty and tired and wouldn't tell you about anything. Your own brothers would tell you nothing. Some of the others might tell you a bit more, and you knew how appalling all the mud, the rats and the dirt was, and you felt it was going on and on forever. We never seemed to get any nearer the end. Restless souls. March Willow Valley, schoolgirl in Sheffield. School days were very different once the war had started. We had great maps in each of the classrooms, and every day we used flags to map the progress of the war on both fronts. In Gallipoli and then on the Somme, when that started, there was a keen interest taken in this because we could see how it was progressing. We had evening assembly every night, and special prayers were said for the soldiers. We always sang the last verse of Eternal Father, and then the hymn, Holy Father, in thy mercy, and then said the prayer, Light now darkness. This went on every night, all through the war. Mabel Lethbridge, munitions worker. When my father and brothers, uncles, relatives and friends came home on leave and were staying at or visiting our house, I noticed a strange lack of ability to communicate with us. They couldn't tell us what it was really like. They would perhaps make a joke, but you'd feel it sounded hollow, as there was nothing to laugh about. They were restless at home. They didn't want to stay. They wanted to get back to the front. They always expressed a desire to finish. Exhausted soldiers. Captain Tom Adler, 7th Battalion, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment. We always felt that someone up above was ordering things, and that they probably knew more about it than we did. We just carried on. I mean, we used to criticise them, saying, what the hell are they doing this for? Or something like that. But we always took it. as being good soldiers, I suppose. The photograph shows exhausted men of the Worcestershire Regiment resting in the mud. To the front. Captain Philip Name, 15th Field Company, Royal Engineers. I think what we all thought and hoped was that the war was bound to end with some form of open warfare. It could never go on forever with this trench warfare. The photograph shows men of the East Yorkshire Regiment moving to the front, not to rest, but to fight. A very grey day. Corporal Reginald Leonard Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. I think Boko was the most intense battle I was ever in. It was really grim. On the first day, we had to get through the wire, which made a lot of casualties. Then there was a very complex trench system, and when we got through the first trench system, you had a bit of open country, and then there were these redoubts and things that the Jerrys were holding on to. The Germans were very good at that time. They hadn't lost their nerve, and it was astounding to me that on the second day we did take Beaucourt because we were very thin on the ground for that attack, and the Germans had brought up reinforcements. I think, luckily for us, their reinforcements hadn't been on the Somme before, and they panicked. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got through. The barrage put a curtain of shells over you. That was the theory, and you advanced. Of course, you're bound to get casualties from your own shells. You were bound to get quite a lot of casualties when you were in a big battle like that. General Freyberg was wounded just near me on the second day. He stood out in the open, and we said, "For God's sake, get in, sir." But he was like that, and he paid the price. He went down, a chap who got about 17 wounds, stripes over his arms. We had a most grueling time that second day. When we got beyond the village and there were no trenches, we went into shell holes, as deep as we could find. But they gave us the most almighty pasting that day with the really big stuff. I think they were 11-inch howitzers. Chiefly, it was a very grey day. Exhausted soldier rests on the Somme. Corporal Reginald Leonard Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. You could see things coming towards you before they hit. It was a most unnerving experience. They came in salvos of 4. That was only one part of the shelling. Of course, there were all the ordinary field guns, but I remember those big guns and seeing those little black balls getting bigger and bigger until they came in the most almighty roar around you. After that show, we were lugged out of the line for a while. Well, we got nobody left. I went in as a platoon sergeant on the first morning, and within the first quarter of an hour, we had our company commander killed and 2 out of the 3 subalterns wounded, with the result that I became second in command because there was nobody else left. On one occasion at Beaumont Hamel on November 1916, we had 1,000 guns massed on a mile front behind us. The noise of battle was so terrific, you couldn't hear a word. Perfect Batman. Lieutenant Montague Cleve, Royal Garrison Artillery. After my first training in the army, I looked on myself almost as a machine in charge of so many lesser machines, which I had to connect up with to make them function. But then as I got into closer contact with both officers and men in the hubbub of war and the tragedies and successes of it, we found ourselves thinking more and more in terms of a family. I know in 35 Siege Battery, more so than any other, the family spirit was perfectly extraordinary. My Batman was also my friend. Batmen were very carefully chosen. A lot of them had been in service, as footmen and other things. They knew what it was to serve somebody, and they served magnificently. I remember the Major's Batman was a gunner called Hampshire, and when the Major was invalided home in October 1916, he handed Hampshire over to me, which was very kind of him. Hampshire was a marvellously attentive person who sought my every comfort. He always saw to it that when I came home all covered with mud from the forward observation post, he would take away my uniform, and next morning it appeared again, and it would be quite smart, with polished buttons and all that. He kept me marvellously tidy, and we became great friends. Slush up to your waist. Lieutenant Montague Cleve, Royal Garrison Artillery. I was forward observation officer throughout the Somme, and coming back one night after doing my tour of duty at the observation post, I found the conditions in the trenches simply appalling. You often had to wade up above your knees, sometimes right up to your waist to get anywhere, and it was an awfully slow progress, because your feet had nothing to tread on. That night I was in the process of trying to get back to the battery when I stumbled and lost my gas mask in the slush. Of course, that was the very night when they chose to use gas. The smell of it was horrid. Somehow or other I struggled back. Fortunately, I think it might have been only lacrimatory gas, causing tears at that time. But there was a lot of mustard gas, and we had to be awfully careful. We were constantly having gas mask inspections, but we didn't have to wear them unless there was a gas alert. But it was very nasty, and it lingered in the ground unless there was a wind to blow it away. I don't think mustard gas affected the artillery as much as it did the infantry. They got the worst of it, as they did most of the trouble. Blighty wound. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. The winter was so cold, I felt like crying. I'd never felt like it before, not even under shell fire. What I had felt under shell fire, especially during the first 2 years, was a wish for a wound, a blighty wound, we call them, to get me home. You thought of a blighty wound was the most fortunate thing that could happen to you. But there were times, after being shelled for hours on end during the latter part of the Somme battle, that all I wanted was to be blown to bits, because you knew that if you got wounded, they could never get you away, not under those conditions. You'd see other people with internal wounds, and you thought your only hope was to get killed outright. Your only relief. It wasn't only me who felt like that. It happened to lots and lots of people. I think we were despondent because after 2 years, the strain was terrific. The luckiest person in the war was the man who went out on the first day, got a nice flesh wound that brought him home again. I've known men to be wounded 3 or 4 times soon after they got to France. They would go in the front line, be wounded, come home, go out again, be wounded again within a few days. The finest thing that could happen to you, if it was a slight wound, you didn't suffer much and you were out of it. The worst cases were those who, and there were quite a few of us, went on and on and on without getting any relief at all. But of course, you had to take the chance of whether the wound would be a nice one or not. There was a further danger of infection. A third of those wounded, even with a slight wound, died of an infection. Wartime godmothers. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. The soil in France and Flanders was absolutely contaminated. I was at Rouen Hospital after I was finally wounded, and this old soul said, "Yes, you've got a jolly nice wound there, mate. It'll get you to Blighty all right, but the only thing is, it's infected." Well, Well, I knew what that meant. I had a tube in there. And every day the nurse had to take them out and start again. I was on my back for 6 weeks, but it was the finest 6 weeks of my life because I could sleep and sleep and sleep. I had to lie on my back, but I really enjoyed it, and the infection cleared up. That wound just about saved me. Yes, it was a lovely wound. Sergeant Ernest Kaganoff, French Army. War being a tough game, soldiers needed some compensation, and during that time we had wartime godmothers, pen friends. We got in touch with them by advertising in a weekly newspaper called La Vie Parisienne. We received many friendly letters, some with a photo of a girl. They would send us packages containing tin food, chocolate and woolen socks, sometimes hand-knitted. One of my pen friends sent me flowers, perfume, cigars and a scarf. That was a very nice present. When on leave, I used to visit my pen friends. We'd go to the theatre together, or to a restaurant or the movies, having as good a time as we possibly could during war. I corresponded with 7 pen friends, and as I had 10 days leave, I had time to meet them all. The Victoria Cross. On January 29, 1856, Queen Victoria instituted Britain's highest military decoration, the Victoria Cross, VC. The medal is awarded to British and Commonwealth Armed Forces for outstanding bravery on the field of battle. The medal was originally made from the metal of cannon captured from the Russians at Sevastopol until the supply came to an end in 1942. The 628 awards of the Victoria Cross given for action during the First World War account for almost half the 1,356 Victoria Crosses awarded throughout its history. In comparison, the Second World War saw 181 medals awarded. Noel Godrich of Arras was awarded the Victoria Cross and Bar for 2 separate actions in the First World War on the battlefields of Mametz and Passchendaele. He died from wounds received in the second action. Arthur Martin Lee received a bar to the Victoria Cross for action in the First World War. He had been awarded his first Victoria Cross for action in the Second Boer War. Of the 627 recipients, 159, over 25%, were awarded posthumously.